Hello, you civic son of a bitch. My name is James Day. Part-time journalist, full-time silly duffer. I love perspectives. Not everyone's perspective, mainly my perspectives, but don't get it twisted, I love perspectives. This episode of Big Chats comes with a lot of perspectives, and it's no surprise either, because we're talking history. Today's guest is Maritime Historian Chris Maxworthy. Following a long career as an officer in the Royal Australian Navy, Chris made a significant discovery about the early years of Australia's colonial history that sheds light on a lesser-known perspective of our past, the Spanish. Long before they invaded our country through the hospitality industry, it turns out the Spanish had plans to destroy the very first European settlement in Australia, Port Jackson, believing it was a threat to their colonies in the east like the Philippines and Taiwan. But why am I talking to Chris? I felt he was qualified to answer a question that's been racking my brain for a long time. Why don't people know a lot about Australian history? One reason that often comes up is that it's hard to talk about. While talking about the past can be hard, it provokes important questions. Like, how do we assess it? By our own standards of morality or those of the time? And are we responsible for the actions of our ancestors? Or do we owe nothing to their victims? About 30 years ago, Australia was embroiled in a culture war over these very questions, which still rages on in some parts of the media today. Dubbed the Australian History Wars, it essentially asked how bad was the impact of European colonisation on Indigenous peoples. There are a few key themes to it surrounding the arrival of smallpox, the stolen generations, and whether the damage done to Indigenous peoples constituted genocide. But an overarching divide it identified in the public conscience was between the black armband and white blindfold views of our past. Black armband meaning the view that much of pre-multicultural Australia was a disgrace due to the ill treatment of Indigenous, Chinese, Pacific Islanders, anyone who wasn't British, women, I could go on. While the white blindfold or three cheers view of history has a very glossy look on Australia's past as largely successful. Think Paul Hogan, Kathy Freeman, the cash cow? Look, there are no easy answers to these questions, but there is a reason I'm bringing it up today, and that is to remind ourselves of a simple fact, that our history can shape our politics just as much as our politics can shape our history.
When it comes to, you've been a member of the Council of the Royal Australian Historical Society, Vice President of the Australian Association of Maritime History. I think you'd know better than most Australia's history in general, on a broad sense. Maybe you don't have the specialised understanding that maybe some of your colleagues have had, but you understand a fair bit of Australian history. But when I go out into the public, especially among peers of my age, there's not that much awareness. There's big moments in our history that people are aware of, such as, the First Fleet.
Well, even some people think the First Fleet was led by James Cook. Yeah. Okay, not true.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, there's awareness of these great events, like the First Fleet, maybe the Gold Rush, Gallipoli, the Federation. But there's not the stolen generations. But there's not much understanding of those events. Why do you think that is, from your experience as an historian and working with other historians, especially on our history as a country?
Okay, so I'll answer it slightly differently. So a great Australian historian who's written some magnificent works on the history of this nation, a name that's Alan Atkinson, so who's now Emeritus Professor, Alan Atkinson. So Alan and I had a conversation with him many years ago. I posed a similar sort of question about what's changed. And he had a very good insight. He said, look, if we think about the past, particularly in terms of the way history is taught and the academic institutions, universities were quite closely allied with their community, with the local historical societies, that people were invested, people had skin in the game. Now, over time, what's happened is we've had so if you think about before World War II, there were no more than about 6 universities across the whole nation. Okay, every major city, or each state capital had a university associated with it. Okay, Okay. Then what happened is after World War II, you had the returning of servicemen and a commitment that in a post-war reconstructed society, people would have more opportunity. And don't forget, people had lived through the Depression, so people knew and remembered how bad things could be. And you had it in post-World War II, you had a process of growth. We refer to baby boomers, so that period of about 15 years from about 1945 all the way through to the early 1960s. That was a period of massive growth in relative terms for Australian society, because you had the establishment of more tertiary institutions. Typically there was a focus on technology. So in each of the major capital cities, so for myself, I went to the University of New South Wales. The University of New South Wales was founded in the 1950s, and it was founded on a technological base, because the only other university in Sydney at the time was the University of Sydney, which had been around since the 1850s. So what you've got is this growth in tertiary institutions, and then in the period from the 60s onwards, you've got further growth in the tertiary sector, because you've got then liberal arts degrees being available from a third tier of universities, and also the growth of colleges of advanced education. So the whole tertiary sector had undergone an explosion. People credit Gough Whitlam with creating the opportunity for getting a good education, but what I'd say is that Robert Menzies in the 60s came up with what was called the Commonwealth Scholarships. In other words, irrespective of your background, if you got a good grade for your leaving certificate, then you could apply for or be granted a Commonwealth Scholarship, which would cover the costs of your tuition and living costs to an extent. Or the other side was if you wanted to be a teacher, teachers were bonded. They were paid in order to study, and they owed a return on that investment. But you've got this trend towards increasing numbers of people undergoing tertiary education. And what also came with that in more recent times is that, for me, having grown up in the 60s and 70s, history was a really interesting subject. History, I think now, is not nearly so interesting, and that's partly because of the way that at the tertiary sector, the new areas of historical inquiry have been pursued, but they might not necessarily resonate with the Australian population.
What do you mean by those new areas?
Well, for instance, a strong growth area is traditionally, in recent times, a strong growth area has been gender studies. Mm-hmm. And that reflects the way we've become more liberal as a society. Yeah. We're more open.
We had big thinkers like Germaine Greer and books like that.
So Germaine Greer was, and also Anne Summers. People like that were into the women's movement. Mm. But it's more than just the women's movement. The whole gender studies thing now encompasses areas of homosexuality and other gender identifications. Yeah. Okay. Now, in some ways, I need to be careful how I phrase this, because, I'm by disposition, I'm conservative in outlook, mm-hmm. but I think that it's taken attention away from the main game. Okay, so I would and also for Indigenous studies, we, as Alan would say, Alan Atkinson, back at the time when he was writing, there wasn't a lot of material available in terms of the Indigenous. Mm. Okay, we're much more we tell a more nuanced story now, and it's very sad in parts as to what went on. Mm. But I recall, I have a daughter who's a young adult now, and I do remember I used to be really wanting her to love history, and the flavour of what she would say to me is, but we just do we talk a lot about the Aborigines and how they were dispossessed. And I said, but there's more to history than just Indigenous studies. She's going, well, I don't see it. And so, to me, that's sad, because I think there is this story to tell about Australia of we are a massive social experiment that has turned out very well for most. And in the scheme of things, there are nuances to it. Particularly for me, my focus is to try and get that element of the Spanish, to tell the story of Australia from a world history point of view. Mm. And perhaps part of the challenge is that we have become quite insular and narrow and disengaged between our community's interest in understanding the history and the special interests that often accompany more modern historical research.
Yeah. So you think there should be a rebalancing to an appreciation of that part of our history? Not to say that there shouldn't be Indigenous studies or gender studies. Like, that's fair enough. There's kind of been I think the generation I grew up with, we studied Indigenous studies and what the colonial powers did in this country, and also in gender studies like the women's rights movement, getting the vote, the suffragette movement, which came out of a push in the academic institutions to, okay, we haven't covered this history as much in the past. I'm sure you didn't really get that education when you were in high school and maybe at university, but we need to do better in that case.
Correct,
and then maybe there's a much bigger focus, especially in our curriculum now, on that part of our history, because before it wasn't covered that much at all. And a lot of the people who, they felt personally motivated to cover that part. But, well, this is an interesting point I want to touch on, is that I think part of when we look at Indigenous studies and how much the British powers did in this country, and the travesties, if you're being taught that as a kid, especially if you're European descent,
Privileged,
especially, you feel guilt. That's a natural thing to come with it. Even though maybe your ancestors weren't there at the time, maybe you weren't there at the time, you definitely weren't, you were too young. But you may feel somewhat personally responsible, and it kind of shuts you down a bit. You go, I don't really want to know about that, and it makes me feel upset. It makes me feel as if I'm party to a genocide, which, maybe in some ways they have been, maybe in some ways they haven't, but they're also a kid just trying to learn about their history. So maybe in a way that shuts down a young mind to that part of our history, and a curiosity in learning about the other parts, the parts that you're speaking of.
Yes. I think that's a fair comment. I think
the same thing happens in the US. I think the same thing happens in the UK. I think the same thing happens in Spain and a lot of the Latin American countries. When they look back at their own colonial past, South Africa too, it's hard. It's hard to look at that and reconcile with it and still be going, well, it's still nuanced. There's still a lot going on.
I think to that point, I think there's an element of you've got to be careful about measuring or assessing the historical aspects from a perspective that is different to what went on at that time.
Right.
So
our own morals.
Well. There's an element of there's an element people might impose their own thinking and says, well, if I were there at that time, I wouldn't have done that. Okay, that's not authentic. Okay, it's very hard to be in the same way that there will be some pushing for social change that we might not necessarily agree with, but they're at the forefront. And in the historical assessment 50 years from now, they'll be seen as the visionaries, and that the rest will, how did society tolerate that? So I believe we need to be careful about assessing the past from our own modern perspective, because you'll find that our own current world, where we think we're being reasonable, will in future generations be assessed as being unreasonable. Yeah. Okay.
I'm sure this stuff we're talking about right now in 50 years completely unacceptable.
We could well be the pariahs, for views that are held. Okay, and that's the nature. That's the nature of history. History is not fixed. History evolves. But I'm saddened by the fact that what I found to be extraordinary in terms of understanding, because history, when you look at it, allows us to understand how we got to where we are today. It's what was the process? What were those quirky elements that led to decisions being made that then led to, for instance, the founding of this nation? If the British hadn't decided for various reasons to have a little convict outpost in the southwest Pacific, what might have gone on otherwise? Okay, and that's the interesting part, and to me my key interest is that, particularly working from the Spanish record, it allows us to see Australia in a very different context than if we work purely from the British record. In other words, there have been debates in the past between various history professors about, well, was Australia just meant to be a dumping ground for convicts? Okay, because that's the general consensus. Whereas some others, like the late Alan Frost, they nailed their colours to the mast and said, oh, no, it was going to be a strategic locus for the British in the Pacific as the interest in the Pacific expanded. Now, I tend to agree with Alan, but the challenge is that Alan hasn't been able to find a document. Alan was never able to find the document where somebody wrote down in British administrative records to say, we are founding this colony because not only will it allow us to do this, but allow us to do that. And therefore people are looking for primary records, whereas my line on this is look at it not from a British perspective, look at it from the perspective of other imperial nations competing with the British and view it as they saw it. And what they saw was a Britain that was always opportunistically growing its empire to suit itself and always being incremental, and also being very discreet in not shouting to the world that this was the plan. The British were always very good at that. And it's served as a role model in some ways for later empires or power bases. So if you look at, for instance, China. So China, in many ways, has grown in a very powerful way. It's got the world's number 2 economy, so it displaced Japan many years ago as being the number 2 economy in terms of economic output and prosperity. And it's interesting to view, the Chinese have looked at global history and they were just doing what the British did, but they're doing it in a more accelerated manner in terms of growing the empire, creating greater influence, being discreet, and so on.
So basically what you're saying is we need to look at the past with a level of objectivity and not looking at the past with judgment in the same way that we look at ourselves in this present day at each other with judgment.
That's true. That's a very. I would agree with that. Yes, I think
because otherwise, it stops us from being able to understand why they were doing what they were doing, to reason and understand the past in a more nuanced way, and put ourselves in their shoes. Even though, by today's standards, a lot of what those people were doing was horrible. But we have to look back with a certain detachment from the actual event sometimes.
Yes, so history is about assessing things objectively. From my point of view, history shouldn't necessarily be a servant of causes or of some new justification. History is meant to be a means by which you objectively weigh the evidence and discern patterns, and as a function of the values that existed at that time. So for instance, when James Cook was given his instructions, so he was given secret instructions. So it said, after you've done the transit of Venus in Tahiti, you're to sail to the west, you're to discover new continents, you're to help resolve issues around what is out there. If you encounter other peoples, you're to engage with their princes and open up good relations. So it wasn't about, you're to go out and seize the land. The challenge is that James Cook set about to engage with different Indigenous populations, both in New Zealand and Australia. And so therefore, and the other challenge we have is that for a lot of the Indigenous history, other than what the British wrote, the rest of the history of Indigenous Australians is an oral record, or it's a record that's incomplete. And of course that then leads to other issues. I'll fess up to being conservative. For me, if there's not a written record, it's difficult to credit it as being viable or reliable, because in the case of telling oral histories, the story can change to suit the circumstances.
That's true, but I guess in modern day there's also an appreciation from some historians that oral history is just as valid. There's very much, like Professor Lyndall Ryan, who you've met in the past, much of her work in mapping the frontier war massacres involved talking to elders
Sure.
who only were able to speak and knew of these stories from passing on through oral storytelling. But yes, there is a vulnerability and criticism from historians such as yourself.
No. So just to clarify, I've never criticised Lyndall.
No, not to say, but there's an appreciation of that perspective, how it can be vulnerable to changing.
Well, it can be vulnerable to influence peddling because it might suit to have a line of a narrative to suit a different agenda.
Yeah,
that's the difficulty I see. And Lyndall with the mapping. So Lyndall, she passed away in the last 18 months. So Lyndall was a very good historian, but unfortunately, the mapping of the frontiers came about because some statements were made in her writings, particularly on the Tasmanian Aborigines, that basically it wasn't properly referenced, and so therefore it allowed others to shoot holes in her arguments.
Right.
Okay, or that perhaps sometimes it was a bit of a stretch in what was written.
Right.
And that then, because you've always got to be careful. You've got to, particularly for the stuff that I'm dealing with here, you've got to be very clear. Where's the record? What's the reference? How can people, after you, go and find that, or even at the time, in order to ascertain the veracity of what you're writing about?
It's a similar sort of challenge in journalism. You go out, you seek your sources, you try to check against those by seeking other people's perspectives, but ascertaining the whole truth isn't always possible.
Hi again. I'm just going to take a moment to elaborate on this chapter of public debate to help explain a little bit about how history is written. In 2003, a man by the name of Keith Windschuttle self-published a book called The Fabrication of Aboriginal History. This volume criticised the way some of Australia's leading academic historians had framed the relationship between the whites and blacks in Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land, over the first half of the 19th century. While he agreed there had been conflict between the parties, Windschuttle argued historians like Professor Lyndall Ryan and Henry Reynolds had, quote, fabricated the evidence of this period to suit their own political stance. The book drew a lot of attention from the media as a result and inflamed passionate responses from both sides of the political spectrum. However, according to Professor Gary Nzidi of the Queensland University of Technology, the evidence in support of Windschuttle's argument failed to cut the cheese of modern scholarly standards.
Cheese?
The professor says Windschuttle judges these historians by unrealistic standards, especially around the use of documentation and footnotes. Windschuttle claims these historians failed to, quote, act in a proper scholarly fashion, as, quote, authors should be able to support, through their footnotes, every factual claim they make. You might think this
sounds reasonable.
But in reality, as Professor Ian Zeedy notes, historians are rarely able to provide a list of every single source they're calling upon, along with an explanation as to how they reach their conclusions about them. Looking at this period of time, 150 years later, all the evidence left to understand what actually happened is in documents written by the colonial government of the time. According to Windschuttle, you only need to look at these historical records to find the truth. But the professor argues few, if any, practicing historians today would accept such a view. All Windschuttle has really done, according to Professor Ian Zeedy, is demonstrate that the same set of documents is subject to multiple interpretations. Much of the Australian history wars are centred around ideology, as demonstrated here. It put two camps against each other and was exploited by the media for ratings, commentators for book sales, and politicians for votes. But there were a few good things to come out of it. Helen Fordham, a senior lecturer at the University of WA, says the wars did two important things. It ended the, quote, great silence on Indigenous issues and paved the way for Kevin Rudd's apology to Indigenous people for their, quote, profound grief, suffering, and loss. So, maybe the whole shit fight was worth it after all.
Can you talk us through the day when you came upon these specific documents that told you this story?
Okay, so I was dealing with the personal file of the protagonist, Jose Bustamante. His full name is Jose Bustamante y Guerra. In Spanish culture, you have two last names. The first one is from your father, the second one is from your mother.
Okay,
which makes family history, I think, in the Spanish Iberian world much easier because you can, by looking at the two last names, you can work out who was the father, who was the mother.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and then similarly, so the names will keep changing as you go past. So I was looking at his personal file in the Spanish Navy records, and I came across this one-pager, and the one-pager had 4 points on it, and it was entitled about how do we defend our South American colonies. And what it was saying is the threat to our South American colonies is from Britain, and the British are very strong in trade with their East Indies because you've got all these goods that are flying from China via the Indian subcontinent and then being repatriated to Britain, where they land a lot of value. And it's everything from silks to lacquered boxes to teas and spices and so on. And this constituted a very large amount of trade for Britain. So luxury goods were all seen as coming from China. Also, the word China, I think I referred to it previously, but China is effectively porcelain, and those porcelains were of the highest quality. They were strong, they were robust, they were very thin, they were elegant, and so as people's lifestyle improved, the aspiration was to have fine bone china as part of your domestic settings.
Yeah.
So all of the European powers, both Spain and Britain and so on, were trading with China. And it's an interesting setup because the Chinese at different times under their dynasties turn trade on and off because if you're the emperor of China, you're at times not that interested in foreign trade because the Europeans were viewed as barbarians. They were lacking refinement. But what they did bring across that was of appeal to the Chinese is silver. So silver was a precious metal very much valued by Chinese. And also certain other things like sea cucumbers or beach de noir, which only came from certain places, and also sandalwood, because sandalwood was the basis for incense sticks.
Smells nice.
It does. Yeah. It does. So anyway, so I found this plan that said, okay, if we're going to defend our Spanish colonies, particularly South America from the British, we need to attack the British and the East India Company trade. In other words, we need to get in there and disrupt that. We need to attack them where we find them. And the fourth point was that we need to go over to Botany Bay, because that was the name for, the name Botany Bay, even though the colony wasn't there, it became the tag by which people referred to the early Australian continent and the British settlement, the convict settlement. Or the other name given was New Holland.
Yeah.
So it was all, because don't forget, Bustamante, the guy writing this plan, had been in Sydney for a month with his warship and along with Malaspina and his warship, Spanish warship, and they conducted a scientific military visit to the colony during peacetime. Yeah. And so this is, they're leading up to war. This is what we need to do if we're to maintain Spanish imperial power in the Pacific. And so I was very excited. When I found that. But the thing I assumed at first was, well, surely somebody else has seen this. Yeah. Can't just be me. Yeah. So that was the level of uncertainty. And I thought, oh, well, when I get back to Australia, I'll look into it, do a bit more research. Yeah. Surely I'm not the first person to find this.
Yeah.
There had been other historians of South America, and also a chap who'd written the biography of Bustamante. They had seen the document as well, but they hadn't appreciated its significance in the early history of Australia. So it's all relative. But then looking at the discussions that were going on between the Prime Minister of Spain and his Minister for the Indies or his Minister for the Americas, there was this discussion about the relative merits and so on. And I'm looking at this one-pager and thinking, well, their discussion is not triggered by this one-pager. There must be more, there must be another document somewhere. So that set me on a path. So that other document I eventually located.
Where did you find it?
Well, I had a research assistant, and Beatrice was very helpful. And I said to her,
"Shout out to Beatrice." Yeah.
Okay, right, yep. And thank you, Beatrice. I said to her, where might this document be? And she was researching in that archive. She said, well, it's not here in the Spanish Naval Archives. And I said, well, where might it be? And she said, oh, well, perhaps it's at the Royal Academy for the Royal Historical Academy of Spain, and which is in Madrid. So, and she wasn't in. I could have asked her to go to Madrid, which is several hours up the road, and go look for it. And I thought, oh no, well I'll save it up for my next visit. So on my next occasion of being in Spain, so this is no longer the Winston Churchill Fellowship. This is Chris Maxworthy funding his own trip. Well, it's fair enough. You
wanted to go to Madrid.
That's right. Yeah. And also it helped in improving my Spanish and so on. Oh. So I arranged. So on the next occasion going to Spain, I booked in a visit to the Royal Academy of History. Met the chief librarian there. Said, this is what I'm looking for. I think it might be in this particular folio or carpeta, like a carpeta, or legajo is like a set of documents. And so we pulled it out and had a look, and sure enough, it was there. And it was about 120 pages of right. So what had happened is Bustamante had written a 4-point plan on this single piece of paper, and he passed it across to the Minister for the Indies, who basically had, and that was in about June of 1796, and then it went through for consideration, and the minister came back to him effectively saying, I've spoken to the Prime Minister, we want some more detail here, this might be possible, please tell us. So he spent the next, as best I can tell, he spent the next 4 weeks formulating a plan and then writing it out very neatly, or getting... Actually, based on the signature, I think somebody else wrote it for him. He might have sketched out the plan and dictated it to the scribe. And then he signed the document and sent it off. But 120 pages, which goes in detail, providing a bit of history, providing a bit of context to the nature of the East India trade, and what a threat it was if the colony at Sydney were to remain as it was and to grow. Because don't forget, when the Spanish had visited in 1793, the colony had only existed for 5 years, and the Spanish were quite amazed at the extent of the colony that had evolved in that first 5 years.
Right, because as I understand it, the perspective of a lot of Europeans when it came to what they called New Holland was pretty drastically different to what it became. It was seen as like a wasteland in a way.
Yes.
That's why they designated it as a penal colony.
Well, okay. So that's an interesting point. Okay, so just to clarify, and for those of you out there that think that James Cook discovered Australia, that's not correct. That was Arthur Phillip. So,
where was James at the time? Was he?
He was dead. So he
got killed by Hawaiians, right?
Yes.
Hi there. Valentine's Day has been and gone, and for those lacking a partner, this can be a pretty shitty date on the calendar. But fret no longer, because there's an alternative celebration for you to rejoice in: the death of Captain Cook. In fact, many Hawaiians still get around this annual event to commemorate their ancestors ridding the earth of a man who was responsible for bringing disease and Europeans to their island nation. The death of James, great name, is a strange tale. A few years after successfully charting New Zealand and the east coast of Australia, Cook was given 2 ships by the British Empire to find a way through the Northwest Passage, a mythical route through what is now Canada that would have allowed the Poms to avoid crossing paths with the Spanish when moving from the Atlantic to Pacific Ocean. Cook and his men decided to approach this venture from the west, which led to their accidental arrival in Hawaii in January 1778. After many moons at sea, the crew were desperate to get ashore and fill their kegs with water before continuing on their journey to Alaska. However, because of the dangerous winter surf conditions, his men were forced to stay the night. That evening, some of the crew were treated to the local women's hospitality, where they in turn shared their own gifts of gonorrhea, syphilis, and tuberculosis. Cook and his crew returned to the Hawaiian archipelago later that year in November. Upon arrival, some local men came aboard their ships to ask the British if they had any medicine for the lesions that were popping up on their precious bits. The Hawaiians knew it was Cook's crew that had brought these diseases, which ravaged the local population, giving good cause for modern-day islanders to celebrate his death at their ancestors' hands. A couple months later, in January, Cook decided to anchor his ships in a bay known as the Pathway of the Gods. Coincidentally, at this time of year, this bay was where a god of peace named Lono would return from Tahiti to bring fertility to the Hawaiian people. Once ashore, Cook was taken by local priests to a temple where they honoured him as the returning god. They mistook him for Lono due to Cook's remarkable timing and because the sails of his ships looked very similar to the god's emblems. The priests called on the King of Hawaii to return from war on another island and take part in ceremonies for Lono, where they also offered gifts to Captain Cook. As the ceremonies usually ended in January, after a while the Hawaiians began to ask Cook and his men when they'd be leaving. Eventually the British left the bay but were forced to return a day later when one of the ship's masts broke in a storm. This confused the locals because Lono was meant to be able to control the winds. So they began to question whether Cook was really this god of peace or just some pom taking them for a ride. In all the hubbub, some Hawaiians decided to steal the little tinny Cook's crew were using to get from their ship to shore, which infuriated Jimmy. Lashing out in his rage, the captain went with a couple men to kidnap the Hawaiian king and hold him ransom until their boat was returned, a tactic he'd used before in Tahiti and Raiatea. But when the king refused to leave, an angry crowd began to gather around the 3 British men, one of whom deserted them and ran back to the ship, leaving Cook and the other behind to face the locals. While the captain and his accomplice did their best to fight their way through the mob, various accounts of the crew claim he met his maker at the end of several pointy sticks. According to an historian at the University of Hawaii, to this day, many local families still claim the honour of their ancestors having stabbed Cook.
But going back to the point, so what we've got to remember is that the Dutch and the Dutch East India Company, which was based out of what is modern-day Indonesia, was the first to land on the Australian mainland, and that happened up in the Gulf of Carpentaria in 1606. And what you have then, the ship that did that was the Doifkin, and from memory, maybe 1 or 2 mariners off the ship were speared by the Aborigines that were there and died. And then over the next 60 years or so, the Dutch charted the coast of Australia, just to clarify, they charted what they had named New Holland. And in the exploring New Holland, they realised, well, there's not much really that we can trade here. So there were, for the Dutch, their game was to make money, and you made money by getting some rare item and trading it elsewhere for tradable goods.
So they were a big part of their business, especially in what became Indonesia, was spices.
Correct. So
that's how they made most of their wealth.
Yeah.
And
so there were certain. So in the Indonesian archipelago, there are certain islands that have certain unique goods. So, for instance, cloves, which are used for preserving things. That's one. Pepper, that was another. So back in this era, you had islands like Ternate and 1 or 2 others. The names escape me, and that's closer towards Irian Jaya or West Irian, which is on the Papua New Guinea continent. Okay, and nations went to war over these goods because they were just so valuable. Some of these spices were more valuable than gold.
Yeah, big fight in the spice cabinet.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah. So,
but this is the first Europeans we're talking about. I think there's a lot of extensive trade between the indigenous tribes of the northern part of Australia,
correct,
and the Papua New Guineans and the Indonesians.
Yeah. So one of the it's come out in research in the last 30, 40 years that there were engagements between Australia's northern Aborigines on the coast, trading between them and native traders that were coming out of the Indonesian islands. And oftentimes that, again, was for sea cucumbers or beach de noix. And that's because it was a valuable item that could then be dried and shipped up to China. So, you've got these various parties contributing or playing in the game in order to make a living. And it was quite seasonal. But so the net effect is that 2/3 of the Australian landmass, then known as New Holland, had been mapped by the Dutch, but they hadn't found anything of significant value to trade, and so they basically left it.
So when they went back to Europe and they told everyone what they'd found, I mean, how did the British then decide, all right, well, maybe we should make a trip down there?
Okay, well, this is there are various narratives that one could point to. Great power rivalry. So if you look at it from the point of view of the British, had both the Indian and Pacific Oceans to themselves in terms of no other British subject could enter that region without the permission of the British East India Company. But most of their focus was on India and China trade, and they weren't that interested in exploiting the resources, the maritime resources. So really what you've got to say is that Cook, James Cook, initially a lieutenant in charge of the bark Endeavour, and then eventually a commander in charge of an expedition of 2 ships, opened up the Pacific from the point of view of the knowledge. He closed the gap. There'd been this concept of a Great South Land that was both in myth and collective wisdom. People believed there had to be something there. And he was, but again, you've got to look at it and go, well, hang on, he didn't do it all on his own. For instance, Abel Tasman had been there 130 years before, and Abel Tasman had touched on what is part of Tasmania. We named the island of Tasmania for Abel Tasman.
Oh, right.
Okay. Back then, it had been, Tasman had named it Van Diemen's Land for a member of the Dutch East India Company that he knew. And then
That's very nice of him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, that's often the way. It's a little bit too egocentric to name something for yourself.
Right.
But also New Zealand. So New Zealand was named by the Dutch, by Tasman, and effectively the name is Nueva Zelanda. So he was naming it as a new part of the world that's similar to back home.
Yeah.
Okay. So Cook didn't discover New Zealand. All Cook did was he circumnavigated New Zealand in order to ascertain the dimensions of that island group. And similarly, he didn't go down to Tasmania, or what was then Van Diemen's Land, but he entered at a point, having sailed from Tahiti, and then proceeded north. Now, Cook, and it reflects the British sense of divine destiny. The British saw themselves as being better mariners and more deserving of an empire than the Spanish or the Portuguese. So what you have is that Cook was aware of the earlier explorations by people such as Torres. So Torres had been the first man to chart a route below New Guinea. So we know Torres Strait, which is the quite constrained narrow waters between New Guinea in the north and the Australian mainland in the south.
Cape York Peninsula.
Correct. Yes.
Top end, essentially. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So what Torres did is he found a way. He was part of there were several ships in this expedition, but Torres was the one who basically found a way through. Okay, and the Spanish at the time were not big on promoting what they had discovered and their contribution to global knowledge, because they were trying to guard their empire and they didn't want interlopers. Whereas for the French and the British and the Dutch to a lesser extent, there was this sharing of information, because they were the smaller players and they were wanting to eat into the great imperial power, which was Spain. So what you have is when Cook sailed in 1768, okay, so a little bit of time before Cook went on his first voyage of discovery, there was a chap called Alexander Dalrymple. Alexander Dalrymple had originally wanted to be the guy that took the expedition to Tahiti, and which James Cook had. So Dalrymple gave effectively a bit of a sketched chart of the discoveries by the Spanish at this time. And part of that was to point to Torres having sailed below Papua New Guinea. Now, Cook never acknowledged that he'd seen this, but it would be surprising for Joseph Banks to have a map and to not share it with Cook. You know, that would... You'd look at that and go, no, that wouldn't have happened. They would have been talking about it.
Yeah.
So James Cook knew that once he'd rounded what became Cape York, that he was home and hose, because he had indications from elsewhere that this was the way home. So once Cook had rounded the top of Cape York, he landed on an island, which is now called, he named Possession Island, and he claimed the whole of the east coast of the New Holland landmass for Britain, and he called it New South Wales. So New South Wales, back in the day, was effectively the whole of the east coast, and then a line inwards to which roughly cuts through Northern Territory and South Australia nowadays. So it was that's what the British were claiming as their own. Okay, and then for the western part, the western half, that was acknowledged as being a process of Spanish discovery.
Right.
Okay. So it's sort of, and this is where it gets interesting. So you have this situation where international agreements that Britain was never party to were still acknowledged and incorporated into the planning of empire. So the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is the dividing of the world into two hemispheres by a treaty, but just before that by the Pope, and it was an agreement between Spain and Portugal, and effectively saying, okay, well, if you're Portuguese, you can sail from Europe in an easterly direction, and if you're Spanish, you can sail in a westerly direction. And then about 30 years later...
You go that way.
Yeah, correct.
I'll go this way, right?
Correct.
So basically, obviously, Cook and the British were not the first to be here in Australia. This document was articulating how quickly the Sydney colony, which was then called Port Jackson, had developed and what threat that posed to the Spanish Empire. So how did it articulate this threat? What did he say?
Well, one of the things to consider is that how do I express this? The Spanish had real-world experience of what happens when Britain gets a toehold or something in an area that they weren't previously involved in. So if you look at the Caribbean, and Jamaica, so Jamaica is an island. The main port there is Port Royal. And what you had is that the British got hold of that in about the 1650s as a result of a war, and they never let it go. So they held on to that. And so Port Royal, Jamaica is quite close to the South American continent. What we would think of today as Colombia and Venezuela, and also to a lesser extent Panama. So therefore, that became a base for them we've all heard the stories of pirates, buccaneers, and the key thing was that even when there weren't wars going on, these English-derived buccaneers were raising hell for the Spanish. So the Spanish were trying to ship silver from their colonies across the Atlantic, and then these guys would come along, steal the ships, plunder, do whatever.
Bloody pommies.
So very, very disruptive to the stability for Spain. And eventually piracy was outlawed by the British. So, but the Spanish had the real world experience of, if you've got a British colony somewhere near their sphere of influence and interest, then the British will interfere. And in times of war, it'll get 10 times worse. Okay. So therefore, based on that experience, the Spanish feared a colony in the Pacific, and don't forget that they had claimed the Pacific as their own ocean for a period of 300 years. That was going to be a difficult long-term situation for the Spanish. So therefore, the best thing to do was, the plan was to basically attack Sydney with gunboats from the coasts of Chile and Peru.
It's a long shot.
Well, no. To sail a large number of vessels across, and then to attack Sydney with hot shot cannon. So hot shot cannon is effectively, you've got a little on your gunboat, you've got a little furnace, and you're heating up the metal balls till they're quite hot, red hot, and then you're putting them in the cannon in order to fire them, and the benefit there is that you're not only got a kinetic energy, but you've got the opportunity that you might start fires, which could further decimate a colony that was mainly composed of wooden buildings. So certainly sandstone buildings is what we think of as the early colonial Australia. But for this particular period, it was more more basic.
Right.
Okay,
and so that's why they were planning to use these.
The goal was also, the population of Sydney at that time was only about 5,000, so therefore it was a relative. The Spanish viewed it as a relatively simple opportunity to, having gained control of the colony, to then take all of those persons, those 5,000 persons in Sydney, and drag them across to South America, where you could use them as colonists. And certainly once peace had come, then some might want to return to England, but you're hoping that some will remain and make a new life in South America. That was part of the thinking. Yeah.
Right. And so at that time, 5,000 colonists, I mean, were they mostly convicts?
The vast majority were convicts.
How many infantrymen were there?
That's a good question. I'm hazarding a guess at several hundred, but I'm guessing no more than 300.
Right.
Okay.
So if the Spanish turned up and started raising hell, was it reasonable enough to expect that the convicts would look around and go, maybe we can take an advantage of this opportunity?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think for any nation, even though you may have been banished to the other side of the world as a prisoner, you're still recognising that from a cultural point of view, your allegiance is owed to your native tongue.
You'd rather be under the British than the Spanish.
And also the British were very good. The British were very good at being propagandists. So, for instance, often in popular culture, the Spanish in the Americas are portrayed as being bloodthirsty and cruel and so on. And certainly the first wave with the conquistadors, that was the case, because they were not particularly what's the word?
They didn't ask to take over what became Latin America with manners. They didn't do it nicely.
Correct. Yeah, correct. It was quite brutal. But here's the thing: that early in the piece, the royal Spanish family endorsed the concept that the main endeavour in the Americas, or all the Spanish colonies, was the propagation of the Catholic faith. Okay, so what you have is you've got large numbers of religious orders that are basically opening up new settlements throughout the Americas. Now, some of those settlements might have been quite cruel, but certainly it was not. There was a large element of propagating the faith, and that conquistador element that had been pushed to the background. For those in the field, there's this concept of the Black Legend. And the Black Legend, which says that the Spanish cruel, bloodthirsty, killers, whatever, that was mainly a British endeavour because it suited the British.
Yeah.
Okay. And
just like they used to call Napoleon short.
Yeah.
Right. That was an element of propaganda when he was average height for the time, but it's enough to diminish the enemy and get everybody on side, culturally speaking.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Yeah. And therefore, to answer your question, to me would be if the Spanish had conducted an invasion at Sydney into Port Jackson, I don't know that the convicts would have necessarily gone over the Spanish side. But it's a hypothetical because it never happened. Yeah.
And why didn't it happen? Was it seriously considered?
Yes. Okay, that's a good question. So what happened as a result of this plan? So this plan, having been written up by Bustamante, was submitted, and basically the hierarchy. The document that I found initially in 2015, where this was being discussed, they were discussing this 120-page document with the detailed planning. And what they did is they said, we will put this into execution. We don't think that the first thing we should do is attack Sydney. The main concept was we need to build our defences in our South American colonies to be able to resist the British, because if there's going to be a British invasion, it's going to be an attack upon our colonies. Yeah. So therefore, what they did is they created a role for Bustamante. They made him the military governor of Montevideo. The important point is that, so in 1796, he's sent to South America. The following year, early in 1797, there's a naval battle. It's known as the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. And in that Battle of Cape St. Vincent, the Spanish suffer quite severe losses of their fleet. And so what that did is that changed the mindset for the Spanish. So always this stuff that Bustamante was doing was on the fringe of empire, whereas the main game was in Europe. As a result of their losses in Europe against the British, I would suggest that for the Spanish, all their thinking then became very centrally European, because they are in partnership with France against Britain, and Britain controlled the seas, and therefore Britain was able to prevent bullion getting across the Atlantic because
Bullion was the currency.
So precious metals.
Yeah.
So bullion was typically gold and silver, and therefore it was difficult to get those materials across the Atlantic safely into a Spanish port because the British were blockading the Spanish ports.
Right.
And so therefore what happened is that in most cases the bullion remained in the Americas until the opportunity came to ship it back.
Right.
But the net effect is that the execution of the fourth point of attacking Sydney never came to pass because it would have been very resource intensive, and for an empire that was doing its best to fight the war against Britain in Europe, it would have been too much of a resource, a drag on the resources to do that for no particular purpose.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So we could have been sitting here if they did go forward.
We'd be eating paella and churros. Yeah.
I think some people would like that.
Yeah. So in the Australian consciousness, we've always regarded France as being the empire that came closest to colonising Australia.
Yeah.
But it never really happened because the British were the British were incrementalists. So Britain was quite good at acquiring new colonies, but not biting off more than it could chew. Whereas for the others, whether it be the French or the Spanish, there was an element of romanticism to what they did, and that romanticism often increased people's concept of what could be achieved and how quickly it could be achieved. Whereas the British were always cautious and careful to not overextend or to take a chance and build on that.
Had they kind of learnt that lesson from what had happened in North America?
That's a good question.
Because they went pretty far into the American continent and they were fighting with trappers from France. And
yeah, okay. So the way to the loss. Okay, so in 1776, the 13 North American colonies that had mainly an English, they were English colonies, founded by Englishmen, 150, 200 years before. They sought to declare independence from Britain, and their argument was that the government in Britain was a tyrant, and the George III was a tyrant, and so on. Now, what came to pass is, as a result of the loss of those colonies, because eventually there was a peace treaty in 1783, so Britain basically pivoted in how it viewed administration of its colonies after that point. There's a professor of history from the United Kingdom called Vincent Harlow, and Vincent Harlow termed this the founding of the Second British Empire. So all of Britain's colonies after that time had a different flavour to them in how they were managed and how they were administered and the nature of responsible government. So what you find now is that, what you found then as a result of the colonising is that there would be an element of paternalism. It was always about good government. It was about rules, applying the rules. It was about gradually over time ceding power to the populace in a controlled manner that still kept them inside the British system.
But let the people feel like they had some ownership of the place they lived.
Yeah. So
despite the real rulers being halfway around the world.
What it was. I don't want to overplay this, but perhaps because you've got a British system where you've got Houses of Parliament and you've got a constitutional monarch, so the monarch couldn't get ahead of themselves, and you had a tension that meant that between the legislature and the executive, it was all about what is viable, feasible, and not getting ahead of themselves. Whereas
there's a continual struggle of compromise between the royalty and the people.
Yeah, the king, the monarch, and his or her ministers, okay, and the administration that goes with that, and the legislature, which at that time, to become a member of Parliament was a corrupt system, But the fact is that you were representing a constituency, and that constituency was typically landowners and people that had some capital behind them. And then over time, that franchise extended into a broader base.
So rich donors, essentially.
Well, let's not call them donors, but people that had skin in the game,
Right.
and they were interested in the government being relatively efficient and not overspending. So that even gets into things like wars. Like, okay, why? I'll contrast it with Spain. Spain had an absolute monarchy. So if the king wanted to go to war, there was nobody to say to him, well, hang on, Your Majesty, let's not do this because, we don't have much in the treasury and we're going to squander a lot of resources. So unfortunately, in the history of Spain, it participated in a lot of wars that were either inconclusive or not of benefit to the nation. A lot of them were based on faith. It was about, taking the war to the heretics, in other words, the Protestants.
Right.
So therefore, that's not a good, making decisions about going to war on the basis of religion.
Yeah.
I would suggest that's not a good basis to start from.
Well, I guess if you come out of the Inquisition, you come out with some pretty extreme ways of thinking.
Yeah.
If there's all this power invested in one institution, you're going to run into some issues, unlike the British, with checks and balances. Very interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, we should call it.
Okay. No.
Thank you, Chris.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Very good discussion.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed it. I know.